Invasive Nile crocodiles, the apex predators responsible for hundreds of human deaths every year across sub-Saharan Africa, have been found living wild in Florida. They've been captured in the Everglades, in suburban canals, and on a porch in Miami. And the worst part is that nobody knows how many more are out there. Florida is already home to more invasive reptile species than any other place on the planet, with around 500 non-native fish and wildlife species now calling the state home. But this situation is different. This isn't a tiny house gecko or a colorful lizard that hitched a ride in a shipping container. This is a predator that can grow over 20 feet long, weigh more than a ton, and has a well-documented history of eating people. And here's something that should concern everyone. Juvenile Nile crocodiles grow 28% faster in the Florida Everglades than they typically do in parts of Africa. Florida isn't just survivable for these animals. It may actually suit them better than their native range. The story begins on April 14, 2009, when a man named Robert Freer caught an unusual-looking crocodile on a neighbor's porch in Miami. It wasn't huge, but something about it looked wrong. It didn't match the American crocodiles that occasionally show up in southern Florida neighborhoods, so the animal was shipped to a turtle and alligator farm in Louisiana, and for a while, that was the end of it. Then in October 2011, a female crocodile turned up at the Preston B. Bird and Mary Heinlein Fruit and Spice Park in Homestead, Miami-Dade County. She measured just 3.8 feet and weighed under 10 pounds. Small, but again, something wasn't right. A third crocodile was caught in March 2014 in a canal near Homestead, measuring just 2.8 feet. Researchers tagged her and released her, and when they recaptured her a year later in Everglades National Park, she had nearly doubled in size to 5.5 feet and weighed 37 pounds. Her stomach contained largemouth bass. She was thriving. Scientists at the University of Florida, led by herpetology collections manager Kenneth Crisco of the Florida Museum of Natural History, ran DNA analysis on tissue samples from all three animals, and the results were striking. These weren't American crocodiles. They were Nile crocodiles, Crocodilus niloticus, genetically linked to populations in South Africa, and critically, all three animals were related to each other. The researchers also tested the DNA of Nile crocodiles kept at licensed Florida attractions, including Disney's Animal Kingdom, and none of them matched. These crocodiles didn't come from any known legal source. As Crisco put it plainly, they didn't swim from Africa. The most likely explanation is that someone brought them into the state illegally, an unlicensed reptile collector who either couldn't contain them properly or, more chillingly, deliberately released them, hoping they'd breed. That would be a federal crime under the Lacey Act, which prohibits the import and transport of illegally obtained wildlife, and potentially a violation of CITES, the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species, which lists the Nile crocodile on Appendix 1, its highest level of trade restriction. 3 crocodiles might not sound like a crisis, and that's essentially the position Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission initially took. The FWC suggested these animals likely came from a single facility that had since stopped breeding them, with all captive animals accounted for. Their official statement said there was no evidence to suggest Nile crocodiles existed in the wild in Florida. The scientists who actually caught the animals saw it differently. Crisco responded directly. If we're being realistic, we don't know how many were there to start with. If we don't know how many were there to start with, and they were many miles from the introduction site, how is it possible to know we got all of them? He added that the odds of the small number of researchers who study Florida reptiles having found every single Nile crocodile out there were, in his words, probably unlikely. That's where the Burmese python enters the conversation, because Florida has already watched this exact scenario unfold, and the consequences were catastrophic. Burmese pythons arrived in Florida in the 1970s through the exotic pet trade. People bought baby snakes, realized too late that those babies grow into 15-foot constrictors, and released them into the wild. Then Hurricane Andrew in 1992 destroyed a python breeding center and released hundreds more into the ecosystem. Over 180,000 Burmese pythons were imported into the United States between 1975 and 2018. Today, more than 23,000 pythons have been removed from Florida, and biologists estimate that number represents roughly 1% of the actual population. In areas where pythons have established themselves, raccoon populations have dropped by 99.3%, opossums by 98.9%, bobcats by 87.5%, marsh rabbits, cottontail rabbits, and foxes are now considered locally extinct across most of the invaded range, an entire mammalian food web effectively erased in about 40 years. Wildlife biologist Joe Wasilewski, who personally captured one of the Nile crocodiles near his home in Homestead, made the comparison directly. "I have two words," he said, "Burmese python. If you would have told me 15 years ago we would have an established population in the Everglades, I wouldn't have believed you." The stakes with Nile crocodiles are especially high when you compare them to what Floridians are used to. American alligators kill fewer than one person per year on average in the United States. American crocodiles, the native crocodile species found in southern Florida, have never been responsible for a confirmed human death in the country. University of Florida professor Frank Mazzotti describes the American crocodile as one of the most gentle species of crocodilian. Nile crocodiles are a completely different animal. In Africa, they're estimated to kill up to 200 people annually. The Crocbite database, the global crocodilian attack database maintained by Charles Darwin University, records between 275 and 745 attacks per year, with a 63% fatality rate. For context, that makes the Nile crocodile significantly more dangerous to humans than even the saltwater crocodile, the world's largest reptile, which attacks far less frequently despite its greater size. Children under 16 account for 51% of all Nile crocodile attacks. Adults average 16 feet in length and occasionally exceed 20 feet. And a male killed in Tanzania in 1905 measured over 21 feet and weighed approximately 2,400 pounds. As Mazzotti noted, fully grown adults are much more prone to looking at humans as food. The female crocodile researchers tracked for a year grew 28% faster in the Florida Everglades than juvenile Nile crocodiles typically grow in parts of Africa. Florida isn't just survivable for these animals, it may actually suit them better than their native range. According to the University of Florida study, favorable Nile crocodile habitat extends along Florida's entire Atlantic coast and the Gulf of Mexico coastline through Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, and Texas. If a breeding population ever established itself, there would be no natural predator to control it. Nile crocodiles are apex predators that could adapt to eating deer instead of zebra, small manatees instead of hippos, and they could kill smaller alligators or compete directly with the already threatened American crocodiles that took decades to recover from near extinction. That recovery is actually a remarkable conservation story in its own right. American crocodiles were listed as endangered in 1975 under the Endangered Species Act when fewer than 300 remained in Florida with only 10 to 20 nests per year. The IUCN Red List currently classifies American crocodiles as vulnerable globally, though the Florida population has responded well to protection. Through careful work, their numbers climb back to roughly 1,500 to 2,000 individuals, and by October 2025, American crocodiles had been confirmed as far north as Indian Harbor Beach, 200 miles north of the Everglades, reclaiming historical territory. It's a genuine success story that an invasive cousin competing for the same habitat could quietly unravel, and one that billions of dollars in federal investment through the Comprehensive Everglades Restoration Plan, or CERP, has helped make possible. Florida has since tightened its regulations, with the Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission adding 16 high-risk, non-native reptile species to a prohibited list. Crocodiles, except for dwarf and Congo species, are now classified as Class 1 animals, prohibited for personal ownership. But 80% of Florida's 500-plus non-native species arrived through the pet trade, and enforcement remains an enormous challenge. Crisco put it well. My hope as a biologist is that the introduction of Nile crocodiles in Florida opens everyone's eyes to the problem of invasive species that we have here in our state. Now here's another one, but this time it isn't just a tiny house gecko from Africa. 3 Nile crocodiles have been caught. The question that keeps scientists up at night is a straightforward one. How many haven't been?